Hi, everyone. We're going to wait till people gather for this conversation and give you all a few minutes to join us. I'm talking with Hina Shamsi, who's director of the ACLU National Security Project, dedicated to ensuring that U.S. national security policies and practices comply with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As I give you all time from Chattanooga, this is a great platform, Hannah, because people are really interested in any given topic. They have an opportunity to ask questions. And I think this involves a lot of legal kind of policies and ideas that I, for one, don't fully understand, although I'm learning by the minute. I want to give you all just a quick update about what has happened lately. I know that more protests are planned in Los Angeles today. The Trump administration is continuing its crackdown on immigration, I think increasing its rhetoric, to be honest, from what I've heard. And Hannah, we can talk about that too. But there was the high profile raid at a fashion district warehouse in Los Angeles on Friday. Public outrage, confrontations with ICE agents, although from what I'm told, the protests have been very peaceful with a few rogue elements. But the bottom line is the National Guard was deployed. The California National Guard was deployed. 300 people, troops are on the ground. 500 Marines are apparently ready to be deployed on President Trump's orders. I did a deep dive into this, you guys. This is highly unprecedented, extremely rare to have the National Guard deployed to a state without without the governor's permission or involvement. And we can talk with Hannah more about that as well, because we looked at all the different incidents when the National Guard has been deployed to quell domestic violence or used in other ways. And it's generally in concert with the governor of that state, with the exception of sort of the civil rights era deployment in 1957, 1963, and 1965. We can talk about that with President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and President Lyndon Baines Johnson, all to enforce uh, Brown v. Board of Education, or the basically integration of schools. But we can talk about that in a moment, because we really should talk about the what's at hand. And Hannah, a lot has happened over the past 72 hours. Can you just very simply set the stage for us, if you could?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's my first Substack Live, as you know, from setting this up. And I'm really, really glad to be doing this with you and your followers. So thank you again. Yeah, it's been a really tough and fast moving period. So there were protests that started in LA when dangerous ICE raids were picking up people, and people came out to protest against snatching up of their neighbors from workplaces and so on. And in fact, an SEIU leader, Daniel Huerta, was also arrested by the authorities, federal authorities there. And so this was something that, you know, by the time that the president on Saturday night issued this memo that we'll come to, even the LAPD had been saying to protesters or commending them for peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. And I think before we get to what happened on Saturday night, it's worth remembering that in many ways, President Trump has been thirsting to deploy the military on American soil, despite how unusual and extreme it is. It's something he talked about repeatedly on his campaign trail.
Well, talk about that. Can you explain what you mean by that? And I just want to remind people, because people sort of join in progress. I'm still getting the hang of Substack as well. But this is Hina Shamsi, everyone. And Hina is director of the ACLU National Security Project, dedicated to ensuring that U.S. national security policies, which have honestly, some of these policies I think have been employed as a rationale for calling the National Guard, but it ensures that U.S. national security policies and practices comply with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. So this is very much in Hina's sweet spot. So sorry to interrupt you, but you were saying that Donald Trump has been thirsting to use the National Guard or military personnel on domestic soil. And you said that he repeatedly talked about this during the campaign. Can you give me some examples of that?
Yeah, he talked about it during the campaign trail. He talked about wishing he had done it and wanting to do it, and named LA as one of the cities that he thought he might do it in. And the question is, and so what this comes to is, you know, the reason I started talking about this was because the situation on Saturday night in California and Los Angeles County was nowhere near anything like the kind of rare and extreme circumstance which might have a president taking that extreme step of deploying the military on American soil. One of our foundational values in this country, in a democratic society, is that the military should have no role to play in policing civilians. Now, sometimes, and you referred to this, Katie, when we were talking about this a little bit earlier, it has sometimes happened. And maybe we can talk about a little bit about how rare it is and the circumstances it's happened in.
Yes, absolutely. And I can give you one, Hannah, only because I've been reading about this and I did a short video. For example, everyone, when there were riots in South Central LA following the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers in the videotaped beating of Rodney King, there were riots in South Central LA. And I was covering these at the time. And Pete Wilson, who was then the governor of California, Hannah, please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, requested the National Guard to help kind of manage the situation, which was very explosive. But it was done in concert with Pete Wilson, the governor, requesting, and I don't know who made the request or who made the offer, but it was George Herbert Walker Bush. In other cases, like after Katrina, if there was looting or some kind of craziness happening, and yes, I can't read the whole comment there, but that was another case when the National Guard was brought in to restore order. But again, always with the coordination of the government. Right?
It's true, but there also, I'd love to pick up on a couple of points from
Please do. You're the expert. I was just saying what I had read.
So I think that when we think about, the National Guard helping out with disasters, that is usually when they are in their state status, the normal status of the National Guard. And yes, there's coordination with the federal government and with other states, but that's by agreement. And that is pursuant to some fairly detailed laws and regulations and, meaningful limits and so on. So we think about the National Guard, the state National Guard, as called out in response to emergency hurricane relief, natural disasters. The other example that you talked about, LA in 1992, my God, yes, so again, it's been a very long time. And one of the things that happened there was that the governor made the request. And I don't know if you remember, but I'd been going back and reading, there were some disasters narrowly averted because the coordination between federal and state and local law enforcement was, they train differently. They do things differently. And in the modern era, it's been since I think 1965 was the last time that the federalized National Guard, i.e., called into federal active duty, was deployed without the consent of a governor. And if I can just break that down here.
Sure, please.
So it takes us back to the civil rights era, last time something like this happened. And it is very, very different from what's happening now is very, very different from the civil rights era. So let me set the stage with like the paradigmatic example that I always think of, which is 1958, right? President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and military and invoked the Insurrection Act after the governor was supporting racist, violent, segregationist mobs, preventing enforcement of a Supreme Court order, enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education, and protecting the Little Rock Nine, right?
Right.
And the National Guard, the state National Guard, had been, the governor had called it out against the Supreme Court order and compliance with it. Saturday night, this last Saturday night, very different. State officials up and down saying the local and state police can handle it. And in fact, that's what the Constitution presumes, right? The Constitution carves out a sphere for state governments to maintain the police power in the ordinary course. It's only in extraordinary and rare circumstances, for example, 1958 Arkansas, that differs. And nothing like that was happening on Saturday night.
And as if you all are just joining, I saw Megan Humphreys. Hello, Megan, and other people. I'm talking with Hina Shamsi. Hina is director of the ACLU National Security Project and has been deeply involved in the events that have transpired in Los Angeles, especially over the last few days. So you're saying, obviously, that these are extremely different situations. And I guess the appropriate follow-up would be, so under what basis or on what basis did Donald Trump and the Trump administration use to ignore Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, to not even tell him about it? According to Governor Newsom, they had a phone call and Donald Trump never even mentioned he was thinking about sending in the National Guard. That's according to Gavin Newsom. So, and I have a feeling I know why he did, but on what basis was he able to do that?
Well, that's where we come to the proclamation that he issued, right? And what President Trump said was the justification. He said that violent protests didn't exist at the time, were preventing the ICE from executing federal immigration law, that he needed to protect federal facilities, and that the inability to do so constituted a rebellion against federal authority. Contrast this claim to, again, Arkansas in 1958. There was nothing that approaches the level of a statute that Congress passed, which is what the president invoked. But I want to pause here. That statute actually only authorizes the president to call up the National Guard out of their state status. It doesn't really authorize, or hasn't been understood as authorizing, purpose and conduct, right? So these are some of the things I think we're likely to see play out. But what's really also important about the president's memorandum, it claims the authority to deploy the National Guard and potentially federalized troops to places without geographic limitation or a really meaningful time difference. The language it uses is that deployment may be to places where protests haven't even started, but intelligence says they might occur. And so what this really boils down to, just to put a fine point on this is unnecessary, it is inflammatory, it is an abuse of power, it goes absolutely against our foundational principle that the military should not be policing civilians, it is placing troops in legal and ethical jeopardy, and it is placing the lives of people in the city of Los Angeles in potential danger.
I heard a military expert talking about this and saying that, the rules of engagement and even sort of what they're supposed to be doing is very unclear. Can you explain sort of the role the LAPD is taking in this, Hannah, versus these 300 National Guard folks that have now come to the area?
Yeah, so the LAPD, state and municipal forces, are primarily responsible for constitutional policing of protest, right? And so there's a lot of practice, there's a lot of thinking and progressive thinking on how do you de-escalate situations. That's the kind of training they have or should have. And the lack of clarity that the person that you're talking about is likely to do with these are these are not things that the federalized military is trained for. Now, National Guard sometimes have a few hours of training in civil disturbance, but what we're talking about here is sort of a policing of protest in federal authority that hasn't happened for a couple of generations.
So someone just asked, do they even have the authority or the right to throw tear gas? You've seen these rubber bullets that are being fired. I saw a reporter from Australia being hit by a rubber bullet in the leg. Do they have the authority to, yeah, someone just said, or use rubber bullets to shoot an Australian journalist?
Yeah. And that was really shocking to see. It really was. That, I understand, was from federal civilian agencies and sort of took us back to DHS and other federal policing. I understand that so far, the National Guard has been playing a support role. So, what we're bringing into the conversation is things were already bad and escalatory as a result of federal law enforcement agencies, right? Who have come into this situation.
Such as FBI agents?
EHS, I think, agencies and others. So that's I think where that is. But if it's happening there, just imagine what might happen if the National Guard, federalized military play a particular role. And no, so the use of less than lethal munitions and tear gas. I would expect that we're going to see more responses to the fact that that does not look like constitutionally adequate policing.
I want to get back to the rationale being used by the Trump administration because honestly, I don't really understand it. I know that like there's the Resurrection Act. There's the how do you say it, posse comitatus. I should have gone to law school, Henny. Anyway, Henna. But can you explain sort of what they're invoking, and can you elaborate on the idea that they can do this in any state in the country now? This gives them broad powers to deploy the National Guard. And then I want to talk to you about just on a human level, how this dynamic inevitably escalates the situation and whether that is the goal. But first, tell me the rationale and the legal principles that are being employed here.
So I did go to law school, and I'm looking at this and thinking that they are taking legal words and phrases that have a particular meaning into essentially fiction land, right? In the ways that they've done in other cases where they've said, for example, that the United States is being invaded. We're not being invaded, right? And so when the language here says that protest commended by the LAPD for First Amendment compliance is a rebellion against the authority of the United States, I don't think you need to go to law school to understand that that's not what's going on. But in response to, let's just move on to what does that mean, right? Posse Comitatus Act, Insurrection Act, and so on. So let me try and break that down a little bit. The federalized military, when it is on American soil, the general rule, it goes back a couple of hundred years in a statute passed by Congress, is that the federal military does not, it's a crime for the federal military to engage in direct law enforcement, right? So search, seizure, arrest, the kinds of things that surveillance of certain kinds, the kinds of things that state and local law enforcement do. The Insurrection Act is an exception to that prohibition. And so President Trump has not yet invoked the Insurrection Act, but I understand he keeps threatening to do that in LA. So that might be an escalation that we see next. But what I would say at this point, my argument would be you haven't invoked an exception, yet you have claimed the authority to deploy the military under rules that are very, very unclear in a situation where there's no need for military involvement. And that's the thing that causes, and maybe this is where we go next, the human danger.
Right. And let's talk about sort of, as I mentioned, the dynamic. So he has not yet called on the Insurrection Act. So is what he's doing, I mean, so if he hasn't done that, then how can he justify sending the guard? Because he claims that national security is in danger, or what?
It goes back to his claim that the protests are preventing the federal government from enforcing immigration law. And again, I see you struggling with it, and I'm with you, because that's not what was happening, right? So
Right.
I think the
But
word it is pretextual.
got it. And let's talk about where this goes. And anyone, please ask a question. Is there a threshold to be met to invoke the Insurrection Act? In other words, what is he waiting for? And, could he still do that?
Yeah. So the Insurrection Act is rarely invoked. I mean, what we're talking about here is so rare. And I think one of the reasons that everyone's struggling with it is it hasn't happened before. This is a novel use of the statute that the president is invoking. But the kinds of things that the Insurrection Act is meant for, intended for when it was passed by Congress, and it's a vague and overbroad statute. It's very old. It's required um, revision for a very long time, but it is meant for actual war, right? And it is meant for an armed rebellion against the authority of the United States. It is meant for the federal government's inability to, quote, execute the law. So let's go back to Arkansas. The federal government, the governor was not complying with a state court order. The governor had instead used state forces to prevent compliance when the Little Rock Nine were trying to go into desegregated schools. Very different from what's happening now. So those kinds of conditions are not met.
And there's that famous shot of George Wallace standing in front of the University of Alabama, not allowing Black students to enter the college, that then prompted, I think at that time was John F. Kennedy, to send the National Guard in to ensure that they could go to school there. But I guess the question is for me, and please, it's interesting. Someone just wrote, for some reason, I'm having a hard time reading these questions because they're in white, you guys. That I guess you're referring to Trump just referred to the protesters as insurrectionists, which is so interesting, as you point out, whoever put this comment in, Julia. Oh, maybe it's my Julia, my producer, that, he didn't call the January 6th protesters insurrectionists, but he's calling what started as a peaceful protest, he's calling these people insurrectionists.
Yeah. And this, I really do want to go back to sort of what was at stake before and what's at stake now, right? In previous times when this has been used, it's been used to enforce the Constitution. What's happening now is to undermine our constitutional rights. We have a right to protest. We have a right to speak out against injustice. People were on the streets because their neighbors were being snatched up in dangerous ICE raids. That's human. Neighbors and colleagues, right? People were protesting policies, and that is core First Amendment protected um, conduct. And what I keep also thinking about is the troops, right? The troops are also have a duty to the Constitution. And now they are being called out for this, let me put it mildly, legally and ethically questionable action. And that's the legal and ethical jeopardy that people have. We think about the Defense Department as probably the most diverse employer in this country. So it also has a lot of immigrants. I know we've represented immigrants in the Defense Department when they haven't been treated fairly in other situations. Um, and I think it is not only likely to be placing troops in legal and ethical jeopardy, I just imagine how it must tear them apart, again, because they are being deployed against their fellow citizens who have been exercising their constitutionally protected rights.
And they do have an option, don't they, to refuse to participate in this. If you're a member of the National Guard, can you say, I'm sorry, I don't agree with this. This feels unconstitutional or is unconstitutional to me. So, you know,
Well,
I'm out. Are you allowed to do that?
here's the nub, which is that um, troops have to follow orders, right? They can only refuse plainly unlawful orders. And so this has got to be something in the minds of troops. And that's why I'm talking about legal and ethical jeopardy, because people have to follow the orders of the president. I imagine people are seeking legal advice. But because that is the case, in our system, we generally rely on political leaders, secretaries of defense to be careful only to issue orders that are clearly lawful.
Right.
And that's not what we have right now.
And specific, I think it's just clearly, I mean, it seems to me that they were deployed to intimidate protesters and, as Gavin Newsom said, to escalate the tension. And I think he called it, inflammatory, obviously. So I just want to add what the New York Times is saying. By calling the protesters insurrectionists, Mr. Trump appeared to be adopting a rationale that could allow him to invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act and use active duty U.S. military personnel to deal with violent protests. So far, the vast majority of protests have remained peaceful, and videos taken on Sunday show that National Guard troops largely avoided clashing with demonstrators. Let me go back to the question I sort of alluded to earlier, Hina, and that is the goal here, the human component of this, to get peaceful protesters to be less than peaceful, to kind of the interaction sort of between these ICE agents and some of these government officials, making it so combustible, if you will, that it's going to create a problem. I feel like they have a vested interest in trying to make this seem out of control.
That certainly seems to be the impact. And I think, again, let's step back and talk about what, and I know we're running out of time, so maybe I distill this a little bit, which is that when the president made these threats on the campaign trail, and ever since, it's been against people who disagree with his policies. And the ability to voice your objection to the policies of the president, no matter who it is, no matter what their policies are, to assemble in order to do that, that is the heart of the First Amendment, which I think is one of the most important freedoms we have in this country. It's one of the freedoms that the press relies on as well, right? To report on this, especially in times of emergency, to tell the truth, to find the acts. That's why we're so horrified by what happened to that Australian journalist. And that's what he's seeking to suppress. And so I really want to leave people with this is the time when we zealously defend our constitutional rights. This is the time that we recognize that we do have these rights that we hold dear, that is part of what makes us a democracy. And this action that the president has taken is dangerous, and it is undermining democratic accountability. But those constitutional rights still hold. They absolutely apply to the troops. I keep thinking it doesn't matter what uniform you wear or who's carrying a gun, the First Amendment applies. The Fourth Amendment applies. The Fifth Amendment applies, and we still have those protections.
So, I mean, so people obviously can go out and protest. They're trying to quell these protests, right?
Yeah.
Get people not to come out and be. And then I read somewhere else this was helping them politically, for people who want mass deportations, no matter, even if people are gainfully employed and have never been involved in any criminal activity. They just want anyone to be deported out of this country. And it shocks me that there's so many people who are okay with this, the way they're doing it.
Yeah, it is dismaying. But I keep thinking about, um, the folks in LA who continue to stand up for their rights and do it peacefully. I keep thinking also of some of the military folks I've been talking to in the last week or so when we thought this might start coming, and especially sort of over the weekend. They signed up to serve a country that has a constitution, right? I think, whatever troops may have to do when they're under the commander in chief, people keep saying they didn't sign up to do this. They didn't sign up to police their neighbors. They didn't sign up to police protest. And, it is shocking and horrifying what happened in LA. I worry about where it goes next. I worry about troops being deployed as the memo contemplates to other parts of the country. But I also keep relying on and thinking about all of these people who are still saying, no matter what I think about President Trump's deportation policy, this is wrong.
Well, Hina Shamsi, I mean, I could talk to you for a lot longer than this, but thank you for uh, helping us. I guess he is helping us understand this. He, I guess calling them insurrectionists is setting the stage for him to invoke this 1807 Insurrection Act and use active duty military, not only the National Guard, but other members of the military, as Pete Hegseth said, who could be used. Is there a fine line between that and martial law?
I think I think there is more than a fine line between that and martial law, right? Like I think martial law is a sort of a rhetorical term. It's not got a lot of legal meaning. And that is where civilian authorities, in essence, essentially replaced by military authority, right? And that is extreme. You see it in, terrible situations in other countries. I do not think that we are anywhere near that. We have got a vibrant and flourishing democracy that we hang on to. And I think one of the things that we see as we go forward is, if and when, and it may have happened, Governor Newsom said that California would sue.
Right. I think they have sued, or he was saying they were getting papers together. And so while this kind of works its way through the courts, what does that mean in terms of the presence of the National Guard and sort of diffusing or de-escalating this tense situation if, in fact, when he does, if he hasn't already sued?
Yeah. So, just my final thought on this. So,
Do you have to go?
I, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I have to interview Doug Brinkley on Instagram about the the historical angle on this. But go ahead, and then I'll stop asking you questions.
No, I could also keep talking to you, but things about the next call I'm supposed to be on.
Yes. No, go ahead.
Which is, yes, it'll work its way through the courts, right? And yes, I would imagine if there are constitutional violations of protesters' rights or journalists' rights, there would be other lawsuits. That's why we and our affiliates around the country and so many civil society exist, right, for accountability and consequences for wrongdoing. But I think it's important for all of us to recognize that this is not normal, that this is pretextual, not normal, that this is pretextual, and to press members of Congress, to ask our representatives, to register our opposition, no matter what your views are. The fact that the American military is being deployed on American soil against protesters, that should worry us all.
All right. Hina Shamsi of the ACLU. Thanks, Hina. Really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful and useful to my subscribers. Please let me know in comments other people you'd like me to talk to. Hina, go do your call. You've got very important work to do. And if anybody wants to join me on Instagram Live, I'll be talking to Doug Brinkley in a moment. Thanks, Hina.
Katie, it was a pleasure to join you on my first Substack Live.
All right, go do your work. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Bye.